We're going to discover what Africa holds for Asia and what Asia holds for Africa. And please give them a big round of applause. His Excellency Dr. Anil Suklal, High Commissioner of South Africa to India. Akshay Mathur, Senior Director, Asia Society Policy Institute. Dr. Renu Modi, Professor and Director, Center for African Studies, Mumbai University. And Professor Dr. Hebatullah Adam, Professor of Economics and Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Jindal School of International Affairs. I will hand over, give them a big round of applause. And I'll hand over to Ambassador to continue the proceeding.
Thank you very much, Vandana. And let's shift gears slightly from the exoteric artificial intelligence debate which we had just before this, coming down to earth. But I'd like to start by saying that very often Dr. Mashelkar and others from the Pune International Center have to explain to people that the Asia Economic Dialogue is not really a dialogue about Asia. It is an international geoeconomics conference, and we talk about different parts of the world, and we are delighted that this year we have been able to focus on Africa, and we are delighted that we have such an excellent panel with us to discuss Africa. I would also say that many of us in India from across the length and breadth of the country were delighted when at the G20 conference held in New Delhi in September 2023, that we in India were successful in ensuring that the African Union became a full member of the G20. And we think that that was something which will help and contribute towards the improvement of relations between India and Africa. We also know that Africa is a growing market. It's very often called the market of the future. It's time that we pay attention to it here in India. So I'm delighted that we can have this particular session, and I'm thankful for all the panelists for coming here to Pune to do this session. As the world navigates a shifting economic landscape, market-driven solutions are gaining prominence. India and Africa remain committed to re-globalization, recognizing that financial flows must be strategic, consistent, and impactful, not solely reliant on government or on sanctions. Before the pandemic, Africa had made significant strides towards balancing trade and investment. However, the pandemic disrupted this progress as border closures and urgent public health demands took precedence. Now, Africa is regaining momentum. The Africa Investment Forum continues to present a vast pipeline of projects, while recent events like the Africa Energy Summit in Tanzania have further reinforced the continent's economic priorities. So today's session will explore how India and Africa can deepen their economic engagement. India has already invested over $75 billion in Africa, making it one of the continent's top 5 investors. However, challenges remain, and we will discuss those in today's session. How can the African Continental Free Trade Agreement facilitate greater Indian and other FDI? So these are some of the questions that I am going to present to our panelists. And perhaps let me start by asking High Commissioner Suklal, the High Commissioner of South Africa to India. And he's just come in a few months ago, and we're delighted to be able to welcome him in Pune. Let me start by asking Ambassador Suklal that with your extensive experience in post-apartheid South Africa's global engagement, how do you think South Africa's model for attracting FDI can be replicated in other African nations? And additionally, where in Africa do you believe the investment climate remains favorable for foreign investors?
Thank you, Ambassador. And firstly, let me also express my appreciation to the AED to include the session on Africa. I don't think any platform today speaking on global affairs can ignore the African continent. But historically also, Asia and Africa has a shared history. In fact, this year we will celebrate in March the 70th anniversary of the first Asia-Africa Summit held in Bandung, Jakarta, Indonesia at least, in 1955. And Pandit Nehru was the key motivator for that conference in 1955, which actually laid the template for South-South cooperation and also was the initiator of the non-aligned movement that played such a big role in terms of the emancipation of those African countries and Asian countries that were still under colonial rule. Now, when you're speaking about South Africa, I think it's important that I go back a bit in history, because India played such an important role in our own liberation struggle. You sent Gandhi to us as a young lawyer. He transformed South African society by launching the first political party, the Indian National Congress, in 1894. But South Africa also transformed Gandhi. I always ask the question, had Gandhi not come to South Africa, developed his philosophy of satyagraha and ahimsa, how would your freedom struggle turn out? So we gave you a freedom fighter. And you, in turn, played a seminal role in our liberation, because it was in 1946 that India was the first country to impose economic sanctions against the apartheid regime. And later that was followed by comprehensive sanctions. So you set in motion the process to bring to the global community the suffering of the majority in South Africa, and ultimately led to the collapse of the apartheid regime because of the comprehensive sanctions, political, economic, social, sporting, that the world adopted, a process started by India. So we have the shared history. Now, of course, when you look at South African society and you look at South Africa, sure, there are some lessons that the rest of Africa can draw from South Africa's experience, but we also had a unique experience. Like most of Africa, we had a colonial history, but we also had a second blow in the form of the apartheid regime, where racism was institutionalized in 1948 when the National Party came into power, and we had the apartheid regime governing South Africa for the next 45 years following the colonial period. But South Africa does have, of course, we are a young nation, and very often we forget that when we speak about South Africa. We're just 3 decades old. And we were the last of the African countries to attain liberation. Now, if you look at what are the plus factors, in 1994, when we got our liberation, Mandela, when referring to South African society, spoke of us as the Rainbow Nation, because we are the most diverse of African countries in terms of race, culture, and so forth. You have a very significant, what we called in South Africa, and this is racial stereotypes that still govern the way we describe ourselves, a very significant white community, mainly English and Dutch, that moved to South Africa from the 1600s, still a very influential and sizable part of South Africa's makeup. You have a very sizable Indian community dating back from the period of indenture and Gandhi's time, 1.7 million, over half of Africa's 3.4 million diaspora, Indian diaspora, is housed in South Africa. And you have the so-called colored community, which is also a major community, bigger than the Indian and the white community today, and the indigenous African community. That is, I think, a plus factor. That's the fabric that holds us together, each coming with a unique contribution to South African society. But South Africa also has certain plus factors in terms of the makeup of South Africa. In terms of our location, if you look at the map of Africa, it's shaped like this, going up. So we hold the whole of Africa, in a sense. We are very fortunate. We are washed by 2 oceans, the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, almost 3,000 kilometers of coastal area. And our exclusive economic zone is one of the largest in the continent. We have the most sophisticated roadworks in the country, over 750,000 kilometers of roads, which put us at 10th rank globally. If you look at the country with the second largest kilometers of roadwork, Nigeria, it's only just under 200,000. So you can see the gap. In terms of railways, we have the most sophisticated railways, 20,000 plus kilometers of railways. The second country, Sudan, 7,000 kilometers. In terms of ports, we have the largest number of ports because of our extended coastlines. So all of these are factors that play in South Africa's advantage, and we have used it so. I must say we have done fairly well, but we have made major mistakes in these past 30 years. As Nelson Mandela said in his book, Long Walk to Freedom, I've walked the long walk, but along the way, I've made certain missteps. And we have made certain missteps in this short journey of 30 years. But I think overall, you must understand that many of you have gone to South Africa. Mr. Kiloska here just told me he came from South Africa. Our first Indian High Commissioner to South Africa, I think, is here. And South Africa is made up of two South Africas. You have the advanced developed South Africa. If you go to Cape Town, you go to Johannesburg, or you go to Durban, and you see that part of South Africa, you have parts of South Africa that's more developed than Europe. But yet we have an underdeveloped South Africa and an in-between middle South Africa. So I think the challenge over the past 30 years has been how do we build a staircase linking the underdeveloped with the developed South Africa, and that's a major underdeveloped South Africa and an in-between middle South Africa. AI has taken over. So I think the challenge over the past 30 years has been... I think AI is also coming into our session. Yes.
AI has taken over this conference, I think.
But I think the other advantage is, I mean, if you just look at India-South Africa relations, there was a great deal of skepticism from the global community. How will a black government govern South Africa? Will we ruin this country or will we take it forward? But India was amongst the first countries that had confidence and came and invested in South Africa. Today we have about 140 Indian companies in South Africa. Various factors. We've just had our 7th democratic elections. So democracy is entrenched in South Africa. There's no chance of a coup taking place in South Africa. We have the 3 tiers of government that operate independently but complementary to each other: the executive, the legislature, and of course, our judiciary. All strong institutions. We have a very sound constitution. We are a constitutional democracy. So these are all factors that is attractive. When investors come, investors have certainty because entrenched in our constitution is the protection of investment bill. So you have that. You have policies that favor the investors, that we have policy certainty, but including also, very importantly, given our infrastructure, including our banking and financial infrastructure, which ranks amongst the top 10 in the world, companies, when they come and headquarter in South Africa, it's not just about South Africa. It's about the larger region. It's about sub-Saharan Africa and the opportunities it provides. So you're looking at a massive market. Africa today is 1.4 billion. By 2030, it will be 1.75 billion. By 2050, 2.5 billion. It is also the market of the future. The UN population projection for the end of this century is that Asia and Africa will comprise 89% of the global population. So 9 out of 10 people walking the earth will be either Asian or African. And that's where your markets are. And Africa is your last frontier of development. And I believe that you will see increasingly an interest in Africa. I'm not going to name countries, but if you look at all of the regions of Africa, in North Africa, you can't ignore Egypt and Algeria, Senegal. In West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire are important countries. In East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia are important centers attracting FDI and developing at a fast rate. In fact, last year, 20 of the 20 fastest growing economies, 11 were from Africa. Of course, from a low base, but it gives you some idea that Africa is now at a takeoff point and it's a good place to be. I was just saying to Mr. Kiloska, and in the short time I've been here in India, there's such great appetite from the Indian private sector to invest, not just in South Africa, the African continent. And I'm saying if you don't go there now, you'll miss the bus. So now is the time to come to Africa and look at the opportunities that are there and to look for mutual partnerships. We have about 20 plus South African companies here. That's too small. My mission is to ensure that we increase this. Part of the challenge is this relationship, not just South Africa, India, but India, Africa, suffers from a lack of visibility. India has such a large footprint on the African continent, but we know very little of it. We know about China because it's in your face all of the time. So I would like to see greater visibility of what's happening between India and Africa, between India and South Africa, and I think now is the time for us to work together for win-win cooperation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ambassador. And picking up from where you left, could I turn to Professor Renu Modi and ask her that do you think Indian investors and government policies are aligned to advance an India development initiative that places the private sector at the forefront of engagement with Africa?
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Ambassador. Before I answer this question, since I'm a teacher, I would like to start by which I always start my initial lectures in the university. First of all, when students come to class, they don't know how big Africa is. So I put an equivalence map of Africa and say, one Africa comprises of a USA, China, India, Japan, and all of Europe. So that gives us some sense of geographic expanse of Africa. It's so important to India and for trading and our economic engagement because it holds 10% of the world's natural resources. And the second thing, when many people from the business industry or students who want to trade and start engagement with Africa come to our classes, we tell them that Africa is 54 continents and each one of them is different. For example, one young entrepreneur came and told me that he was canceling his trip to Kenya because there was an Ebola outbreak in West Africa. So I had to tell him it is 4,600 kilometers away. So these are the specificities that we keep in mind while talking about Africa. Now, specifically to your question about whether the Indian government and the private sector interests are aligned, depends on who you ask the question, sir. Suppose I go to a marketplace in Kariako in Tanzania where we were doing research on textiles. The local trader is a Gujarati person who has gone from Jaipur to Africa. He doesn't know what the embassy is about. They work through the diaspora networks. So for him, he'll say, no, we do our business and trading on our own. If you talk to a Tata, Mahindra, Kirloskar, they will say, oh, we came with an Exim Bank LOC. So we are working with the government of India. And yes, all our business is aligned as per with the embassies and the government of India. But there's something in between I would like to mention that for me, the answer is in a definitive yes, because there's an ecosystem which has been created for the foray of private sector into Africa. And I'd like to just go down a little bit of history from 1964 when we set up the ITEC programs. Second, in 2002, the Focus Africa program that the ministry set up to increase trade with Africa. In 2004, where we set up the ideas and the Exim Bank lines of credit on soft terms to share India's developmental experiences were launched. And the Team 9 initiative in 2004, when West Africa was incorporated into our development plans and economic initiatives to Africa. And most importantly, the 3 India-Africa Forum summits of 2008, 11, and 15, which intensified our cooperation. And most significant among that is the duty-free tariff preference scheme, which allows for market access of 98.2% of its products from 33 LDCs into India with no tariff on a non-reciprocal term. And I think India was the first country to do so. And in 2015 was a very significant year as well, because we took stock of what was going right and what was going wrong. So we also had an assessment of which policies were working in Africa and which were not. So in brief, yes, our government of India policies and the private sector interests are aligned. And one thing the private sector always tells us is that the government needs to increase the ease of connectivity. There are no Indian connectivity flights to Africa. Everybody has to take Emirates, which is too expensive. And the other option is the Ethiopian. So we need to increase, and of course, the increase in the number of Indian missions is very much appreciated. The setting of the commercial attaché is also one of the positive steps. And the hand-holding and at times the private sector does turn to the Indian high commissions in terms of crisis, which is very well noted by the Indian private sector investors. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Modi. And perhaps what I can do is turn to Dr. Akshay Mathur of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and maybe I ask him that a stronger India-Africa economic partnership obviously is crucial, but in your view, what could be the key drivers of this partnership, especially in the second quarter of the 21st century? And how can India's entrepreneurial and industrial strengths support Africa's development without relying on sovereign guaranteed loans?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bambawale. Actually, built into your question are two important things. One is that you've given me a runway of a second quarter century. Thank you so much. So when we do this edition, 25 years from now, when it'll be 31st edition, then it'll be interesting to look back. And the second thing is you've pushed me to think about a non-sovereign backed approach. I'm actually a little bit more concerned, I suppose, than some of my fellow panelists. I think we have serious challenges coming our way for all developing countries. And I say that for India, but I also say that for major parts of Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. But I don't want to break it down regionally. I'm developing parts of Africa. What's happening in the West with the change in government, the Trump administration coming in, climate change, other geopolitical conflicts, we have to be cognizant that there are capital outflows. And for developing countries, capital and technology have remained and will continue to remain as the most important drivers. India and Africa cannot actually build a relationship or economic relationship in vacuum without these two inputs. And capital is going to become, or is becoming, scarce. The second thing is that the geopolitical risk premium is increasing. And as if we did not already have enough factors that went into political risk insurance without what is happening in the last 1 year or last 4 years alone, this has added to the complications. Now, this has impact on two things. One is that it limits on what the government can do, and it has limitations on what the business can do. Now, I think, let me break it down into two things. So let's focus on one. I know you said sovereign, but I wanted to just also break that down. You see, the African continent, just like India, is also dependent on the West for capital. Maybe top 5 of its major FDI, or at least 4 out of 5 are all from Europe, in fact, and the United States is the other one. If you look at a financial instrument like Euro bonds, over $100 billion worth of Euro bonds are outstanding. And African countries have borrowed. And Euro bonds are not cheap, they're high interest instruments. And now with added public debt, which has not gone away from, since we had COVID, this adds pressure. It adds pressure to all countries. Now, we have one more thing that we need to consider in the case of some of the African countries. Again, I know we're dealing with 55, but there are certain commodity exporters, and if they're not commodity exporters, many of them are commodity importers. This is one difference from India. I mean, we are energy importers too, and commodity importers and exporters, but in the case of Africa, the percentage and reliance on revenue is quite high. And what's happening in the world as the shocks in the global system increase and the prices fluctuate, that adds more vulnerability to a lot of the economies. All this to say that the pressure on government and pressure on businesses to continuously hedge, de-risk, create buffer capital, or if they have some capital to keep it in reserve, increases. So we are in a bit of a difficult time when we look at geoeconomics and global macroeconomics. I think if we look at India and Indian government specifically, Renu actually highlighted a few things about lines of credit. I particularly think that opening up of some of the rupee Vostro accounts was really a good move. So there has been some experiments that we have been doing, and our credit agencies are trying to give political insurance cover, etc. I think it's worked to some extent. I think it has its limitations because beyond a point, even the government has only so many instruments and schemes at its disposal. So this brings me to the point on what businesses can do and what's happening in business. I was really intrigued that Rama's not here. I think but as I was flipping through her book, Lilliput Land, which is outside, I saw a very interesting factoid that stood out to me. So in her book, she says that there are 30,000 brands that small family-owned businesses have launched in India. 30,000. Whereas the multinationals have about 3,000, right? So this made me think this morning that, of course, multinationals is one way and they have made their approach. We always talk about Godrej products aside. When we talk about consumer products between India and Africa. But how do we get these other 30,000 products there? And I was trying to have a conversation with Prashant just before I got on, what is the composition of the Maratha chamber? And he was saying that, 70-80% of the exports that are coming out of the Pune region are by MSMEs. So I think we use the term MSMEs, medium and small enterprises in India quite a lot. But I think we need to use and not just use, but own and support family-owned enterprises and family-owned capital a little bit better. I think our approach in India requires us to focus a little bit more on what we can do. I think there is a slight difference because we're not small and medium enterprises like Germany's Mittelstand. Our small enterprises, which are family-owned, requires the proprietor or the owner to travel, to take decisions somewhat on relationships, but sometimes on instinct. So flights are probably an important component of that. And finally, I'll stop or make a point on trade agreements because, India doesn't have a great history with trade agreements. Our trade utilization rate is about 20%. That means only 20% of what we export actually goes through our FTAs. And that's a problem. And so how we leverage Africa's Continental Free Trade Agreement remains to be seen. I think the bigger companies will do a better job immediately, whether it's Indian or foreign. Toyota can go in there, or perhaps Kirloskar can go in there and can leverage it. But what do we do about the other industries? That remains to be seen. So I think I'll stop there, making this point that there is room for us to actually work a little bit more on family-owned businesses, and perhaps in some kind of a consortium-led model. And we can talk about that if there is still interest.
No, thank you so much, Akshay. And I'm glad that you mentioned the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because I think I'll turn to Professor Adam and ask her that, do you believe that this African Continental Free Trade Agreement will significantly impact Africa's ability to attract foreign direct investment? And if so, how?
Thanks, Ambassador Gautam, for your question, inspiring question, and especially as I'm teaching for my master's students international economics, so I feel related to this question. So speaking about African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I believe yes, answer first. is yes, it will give immense potential to African nations to attract more of foreign direct investment to our continent, and also not only foreign direct investments, even for our own national investors. They will be now much more happy to invest more in the continent rather than going and investing abroad. Why it is appealing to invest and get the maximum benefits of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? Because speaking about the fact, if we, as Ambassador Anil has mentioned, we have in Africa 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and our GDP in Africa is comprised is over around 3 trillion US dollars. So all this makes that trade integration. We have the largest trade integration in the world with, if you are speaking about number of countries that are member of this trade integration. So it will give more opportunities and benefits for foreign direct investment. But there are challenges that I will highlight at the end. But I need now to speak more about what kind of benefits that foreign direct investors can get from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. First of all is market access, because it will be easier for a foreign direct investor to just to have their first factory installation or business to be open in one of the African nations, and it will be easy to get access to all other member countries in the agreement. So they will not go through all the bureaucratic struggles and to have to get access and to more countries. So it will be quite easy for them. Besides that, also there is speaking about supply chain. So it will open door for intra-regional integration. More of a regional supply chain can be created, especially in agribusiness and manufacturing. So foreign investors, they can easily get their raw materials, intermediate goods from different African countries and get the maximum benefits of the low cost and of course the high production competitiveness. Of course, one more point is related to the reduced tariffs and non-tariff barriers. So according to this agreement, 90% of tariffs will be waived. So of course, again, this will give to the business, to the private business investor and foreign direct investors to have less costs now. And of course, again, it will increase their competitiveness when they will export their products abroad. So there is so much, or we can say there are immense benefits from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to African nations and to foreign direct investors. But still, we have to admit it is not that much happy picture, and there are struggles and lots of challenges that we are facing in Africa. First of all is infrastructure gaps between the member of the African nations. As Professor Anil has mentioned, we are not all sharing the same, we are not all at the same level of economic growth and development. So much challenges, especially for infrastructure and energy and technology. So this is one of the main challenges. Also, we need to have a strong political will in Africa to make this integration to grow and to be a solid ground for future economic cooperation between the member states of the agreement. So I hope it will be a success story after some time. And for Egypt and South Africa, we do have a strong relation, and so maybe we can be, we will lead the continent for more future success. Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy, Professor Adam, that you mentioned the challenges. And Ambassador Suklal, if I could turn to you once again and ask you that, you know, many Indian businesses and Mr. Sanjay Kirloskar of Pune, who's sitting here, he goes to Africa a lot. But Indian businesses often cite political risks, inconsistent policy implementation, high local financing costs as major challenges in Africa. So in your opinion, how can these issues be addressed to create a more conducive investment climate, and also the infrastructure point which both Professor Modi and Professor Adam made?
Well, I think you have to see what's happening in Africa in perspective. All three issues you've raised are issues that I believe are being addressed and are in transition. You know, just to give you two examples. In May 2000, The Economist magazine, I'm sure all of you are aware of, the cover picture was Africa, the hopeless continent. That was May 2000. In 2011, that same Economist, the cover picture and lead article was Africa Rising, in a matter of decade. Now, you have to also understand where Africa is coming from. You have to go back to the roots. Much of the problems we are experiencing in Africa today emanate from the 1884 Berlin Conference, when the colonial powers decided who's going to rule which part of Africa and divided Africa. I mean, what you're seeing between DRC, Rwanda, Great Lakes region today, it was all one people, just divided arbitrarily, borders made, straight line. If you look at some of these lines, they're just so straight. And Africa is still in its infancy in a number of areas. Now, the second example I want to use is when I served as South Africa's ambassador to the EU. During that period, we were negotiating with the EU the free trade agreement called the EPAS, Economic Partnership Agreement. Africa was divided into 5 regions. South Africa was part of the Southern African region, a group of 7 countries. For the major part of my 6-year stay there, I was part of the negotiating team. There were 2 countries, I wouldn't mention the names, that didn't have the capacity to negotiate. They had to get assistance from our European partners. Now we're negotiating with the Europeans, and they are the advisors of these 2 countries. And we felt very uncomfortable with that. But that was the reality. It was their sovereign right. They asked for assistance, and this assistance was provided. So I'm saying in terms of policy development, what you're going to see, and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to force African countries, the majority of whom where we don't have policy development, policy certainty, to deal with this in a serious way so that you can fully benefit from the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And likewise, foreign partners will also benefit from this. And this is an evolving situation, and this is where I believe India can help Africa. Because of the expertise you have, if you want to move from aid to trade, help us to have a regulatory environment that will facilitate ease of doing business in the African countries. And given your experience, you can help us. But this is not unique to Africa. You find this in West Asia, high-risk area. But the investors are still going there. Same with Africa. The investors will complain, countries are more cautious. But capital will flow. Wherever there's opportunity, capital will flow. They always say capital is a coward. As soon as there's a problem, capital will run away from there. But that's the nature of how capital is. And I'm saying Africa provides opportunity. We are learning. We have to have policy certainty, develop these areas of governance. We're going to need help, most of the countries in Africa. And the cost of financing. One of the reasons within BRICS we decided to create the new development bank, and it was late Manmohan Singh. It was his idea. I was at the very first meeting here in 2012 when we convened, and it was just an idea. Let's create our own development bank. And the NDB was based on the reality we face as countries of the Global South in terms of access to capital. Africa is facing the same. I mean, if you look at Africa's infrastructure needs today, we need anything between 130 to 170 billion annually to address our infrastructure needs. But the deficit is anything between 70 to 108 billion that we have to raise. Where are we going to raise that? It's not going to come from Europe. That's where China sees an opportunity, and China moves into that space. So I'm saying that we have to engage more with our partners from the global south, and we have to generate. We have to generate capital ourselves within the African continent. We have amongst the lowest saving rates globally. We have to change that pattern. We have to change mindset. And I think these are some of the things we have to address within the continent. And I believe these are being addressed. We are fortunate that we have a continental organization. We are fortunate that we transformed the OAU into the AU in 2002 for a reason, because the OAU was more focused on the liberation of the African countries. The AU focused more on the economic development and the development challenges of Africa. And that is why in 2001, before we could even transit to the OAU from OAU to the AU, we launched NEPAD, New Partnership for Africa's Development, as our blueprint, the Marshall Plan for Africa, designed by ourselves. Then in 2013, we launched Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want. 2018, we launched the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it's work in progress, and if you look at where the continent was 20 or 30 years ago, where we are today, I'm very optimistic. We're moving in the right direction. Yes, there are major fault lines, as was pointed out. We live in a fractious world, a world that is splitting more and more, and this impacts on the poorest and impacts on Africa in a very great way. But we have partners from the global south. Why did you launch under your G20 presidency, the Voice of the Global South? And the 3 editions that you have, you address the fault line as it impacts on the global south, Africa included. And I think we in the global south will have to start doing more amongst ourselves, because that's where your markets are and that's where the future is. And Africa is part of that equation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, High Commissioner. Let me turn to Professor Renu Modi and also ask her that whether she shares Ambassador Suklal's perspective on these challenges. And in your opinion, Professor, what strategies could help mitigate these risks for Indian and other investors from Asia and maybe even beyond?
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. So I'll take this very interesting cue from Ambassador Suklal when he's talking about the economist. So one of the challenges I feel that Indian business face is following the Western narrative. For example, the economist that he mentions. So in 2000, you have Afro-pessimism, as he says, hopeless continent. Then comes the financial crisis, 2008, when markets are down. And then 2010, McKinsey comes with the report, Lions on the Move. Following that, quickly, Economist brings the article on Africa Rising. 2013, Economist comes with another article, Aspirational Africa, talking about the consumer market of Africa. And 2019, it comes with a new cover page of New Scramble for Africa, alluding that China is the biggest villain in Africa. So I feel that we should set our own star for sailing. You cannot follow the narrative of the Western media, because following the Lions on the Move report, I heard many business people who invested in land, and Karaturi Global was around that same time, and many investments happened in land without due diligence, so that is one of the challenges. 300,000 acres of land were purchased, and then this expanse of land is so vast that, for example, one of the persons an Ethiopian student who worked with them told me that when there's a tractor breakdown in Afar region where the farm is, to get a spare part, you have to come to Addis, which is 14 hours or 15 hours. I mean, there's a long flight, and half of them are not available. So they have to be shipped from or airlifted from India. So these are the kinds of challenges of without a support structure. Then there are, when the due diligence is done, the study is done of the country. Then you have bordering Sudan, where there is a Baro River which is flooding. So no assessment is made of a full assessment of what's happening. So one challenge that Indian companies can, how to face is to do due diligence and have their own have their own star to sail and not follow the Western media narratives, which are like sponsored ads, I feel. And the second thing is now the narrative in the Ministry of External Affairs, I feel, is also changing. Because every time we went to the CII conclave, which I attended since 2005 many times, and every speech started with our connections through the house. But over the years, what I have learned is money is sharper than sword. So the business, no longer that narrative holds true. Second thing is that people which I talk to now, I was in Senegal and Mozambique recently, and I just questioned them, how do they work? And they say that localization of partnership, and I was in Rwanda recently, and so one of them told me that there is no API manufacturing in Africa. Just taking one example from pharma sector, because Ms. Shaw was there yesterday, and there's no API manufacturing. So there is a border conflict between Rwanda and Uganda. So a saline plant, which is in Uganda, now will ship the same saline through Kenya, which is even more expensive, because there has been a border conflict. So conflicts. Second, regime changes. Well, what happened in Ethiopia? It burned the fingers and the appetite for investment in land. So one government comes and then changes the rules and says, no, this was purchased under the federal law, but this was a national law, So that kind of a thing. And therefore, there have to be better bilateral investment protection treaties, legal assistance treaties, double tax avoidance treaties. The business community would know better about these. But what I'm saying is, and the private investor has to be aware of these. And just to get back to the pharma sector example, talking of South Africa, I have many colleagues and friends who are in the pharma sector from South Africa, and they say it has a best regulated market, but to get one regulation approved, one pharmacopoeia approved, it takes 5 years, and that in South Africa. So with the AFTA, they hope that, or they put forward every time at every academic seminar and writing, is there should be one Africa, one pharmacopoeia, one regulation, and valid for entire Africa. So these things need to be done. Then, of course, we have mentioned transport. And Ambassador, it's really interesting, we sometimes the figure of bilateral trade in MEA documents and all, maybe 100 billion and all, but I think the best place to research on Africa trade is the airports and flights. So we find so many young people who are working in the Tanzanite factories in Dar es Salaam. Some person from Rajasthan has a small travel agency in Senegal. He speaks French. His children are all there. I don't know even if we ever collate that data into our trading. So I feel there's a lot of intense trading going on at the ground level, people-to-people level, which escapes government data collection. And so I think we are much more engaged in Africa. And as Ambassador said, there is no visibility. I was in Mozambique last year, and there's one bridge which has been made from Maputo to, I forget the name, there's a temple there, Siawanga. And there's a big red board saying Friends of China or something like this, There's an agricultural demonstration farm which the Chinese have made. There are huge billboards saying, it's a friendship cooperation farm or something. But there's so much of Indian presence in many of these African countries. I have never seen a billboard. There's a Godrej factory there in the industrial area, but we didn't even see a big board. So as he says, we need visibility and more people-to-people interaction. And of course, coming back to business, we must bring in the challenges mentioned that there's more African agency than there used to be. And take the example of Rwanda just this week. They have told the Belgians that they do not want the bilateral aid anymore because Belgium does not approve of Rwanda's stance on the M3 rebels, or the support to the M23 rebels, which they have denied. So there can be no political interference and total respect for every country. And I think these are the challenges that I could think of. Thank you so much.
I'm happy that many of you have mentioned about people-to-people exchanges, that there is a presence, an Indian presence in different parts of Africa, but there's very little doubt that we need to step up people-to-people exchanges. High Commissioner Suklal mentioned to me that right now there is no direct flight between India and even South Africa, leave alone other parts of Africa. So there's a lot to be done. and I hope that gets done in the coming years. Dr. Akshay Mathur, if I could turn to you and ask you that India provides 97% duty-free tariff preference access to African least developed countries. Do you think this serves as a strong incentive for Indian companies to invest in Africa and enhance trade and investment? And how can this initiative be scaled up for greater impact?
I think I probably gave a hint towards the end of my last intervention that, India's utilization rate of FTAs is close to 20%. That means only about, and this is average, but there are areas where it's lower. And so that's the amount of trade that goes through the FTA which has been signed. Amongst India's top 10 trading partners where we export, we have FTAs with only 3 of those nations. The whole world trades with China, but very few countries, for instance, have a trading agreement with China, right? So, I mean, the United States and China have $600, $700 billion worth of trade, and they have no agreement between each other. I think the point is not that we do not need a trade agreement, but I think that there is a recognition that the era of creating a framework, a liberal trading economic order which lent itself to trading arrangements, regional trading arrangements, global economic frameworks, I think that is now either in question or it's gradually petering out. And so, like for instance, and what is replacing it are other kinds of geoeconomic arrangements, and there are 2 that come to mind which I wanted to bring to your notice. So for instance, we had the Black Sea Grain Initiative that the United Nations brokered with Russia to get the food grains out of Ukraine. Renu and I were just talking about it. Who participated in that? Was African countries party to those negotiations? Was India party to those negotiations? I certainly can't say who was in the room or not. But I think it's clear that in that kind of a geoeconomic arrangement, which has significant impact on commodity prices, flow of food, it's really important. Same thing with the Russian oil price cap system, which was introduced by the United States and Europe to cap Russian prices. Where was India and Africa there? So these are significant issues which have an impact on even how India and Africa trade with each other. So I think the time for deal making has come. I think it's more targeted. It's more investment driven, I think. And I think that's where the government machinery and business will have to now step in and build capacity.
And let me ask Professor Adam, and let me say that after this, we'll open up to the floor. So I do hope that there'll be some questions from the floor to any of our panelists or to all of our panelists. But Professor Adam, if I could ask you from an African perspective, do you believe that the duty-free tariff preference program is an effective tool for attracting Indian investment? And what improvements can be made to encourage deeper investment from India? How do you think we should go about that?
Thanks, Ambassador Gautam, for, again, this interesting question. Speaking about the DFTP program, yes, I believe it gives immense opportunities for Indian investors to discover good business opportunities in Africa and get the maximum benefits of it. Especially as you have mentioned in your introduction, according to this agreement, it waives tariffs for 97% of products originated in Africa, and they can have access to the Indian market. So yes, it gives good opportunities, but again, there are challenges that the Indian investors are facing in Africa, including what? Including first, and the most important is the inadequate infrastructure, and we have all agreed on the inadequate infrastructure. Political instability, the business environment, and of course is not attracting the Indian investors and also other investors to pump more of their financial flows to the African continent. And another point also is important to mention here is we have in Africa limited export diversification. So we end up by just exporting to India just primary raw materials and very few manufactured goods. So this is a big challenge because we are not able to increase our production capacity and produce high value added goods where we can get the maximum benefits of such kind of agreements. Answering the second point in your question, what improvements could be made to encourage deeper engagement? So I believe first we should work, and here India can support Africa on capacity building, as we need more of technology transfer and production capacity building, increasing our the quality of goods produced. So we need to have more assistance from the Indian side to train our youth and producers on how to be able to compete in the international market and therefore to get access to the Indian market later. Another point to mention is, of course, the infrastructure, because we have all mentioned the infrastructure. So we need to have more investments. We know that China is giving huge amount of money to African countries to build their infrastructure. So it will be good opportunity for India also to compete with China and to have, in collaboration, of course, with international organization, and to invest more in sustainable infrastructure projects in Africa. And since we are talking about trade, we cannot forget the trade facilitation. So we need also to have a complete reform in our customs, duties, and logistics, non-tariff barriers. So all this, of course, needs to be reformed, and we can also implement it the same, since we were speaking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So it will be a good opportunity if African countries discuss this and implement a complete reform of trade for trade facilitation purpose. Lastly, for the last point, what can African countries do to attract more foreign direct investment from India and from other also investors from other countries? We can have, for example, like establishing new special economic zones and provide more tax incentives, invest in infrastructure and in energy sector, digital transformation. So here it will attract more investors, and because they will have their investments with a lower cost in Africa, and it will increase their competitiveness when they will export their products to other nations. Also, what can be done is that African countries, they can attract foreign direct investors from India and from other countries through public-private partnerships. And here also it can be in education or in healthcare, the sectors that we need the most to have cooperation and partnership with private sector in Africa. And we have very good experience in Egypt in having mutual agreements with private sector to invest in public services like education and healthcare. So we can also try to expand the same experience and through capacity building and sharing knowledge with our African friends and brothers. The last point is that can be done, of course, since I have mentioned that for any investors, and also Professor Anil said that we don't like instability investors here. So we need to have political and stable environment. So we should work on establishing a sustainable and stable political and business environment, increase governance transparency, and that point has been mentioned yesterday, and India has done a lot in that. So again, India can help the African countries in increasing their governance transparency and to assist them in their political transformation towards democracy. So I hope that we will have more of, especially what we need from India as Africans. That point, 2 points, like to summarize from all I have mentioned: infrastructure and capacity building, and we can expand the ITEC program, and of course if we can have more of the African scientists to get opportunity to be trained in India and open doors for them here, especially in sectors like agriculture and IT. Thanks.
So with that, I think we have just a little bit of time for questions from the floor. And if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and please do mention to whom the question is addressed. So questions from the floor. I can see a hand up here in front. Mr. KP Nair, his hand up. Please go ahead.
My name is KP Nair. I am a columnist. I would like to ask the panel if India's relations with the African continent is ethnically lopsided. What I mean is because, for example, in East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, which have a large number of PIOs, persons of people of Indian origin or overseas citizens of India, get a lot of attention and focus in my experience. And the other country that gets attention is, of course, South Africa. Again, for reasons of Indian community and for historical reasons. I'm excluding Mozambique and Angola because of the energy potential of these countries. But barring these, is there, are India's relations with the rest of Africa focused on these countries to the exclusion of the continent as a whole? Is the rest of the continent suffering in terms of India's relations because of this ethnic factor?
So let me, as chair of this session, let me take the, and let me ask that, is that question should be addressed to the two African representatives we have on the dais. So perhaps we can start with High Commissioner Suklal and then Professor Adam.
I wish that was the case, Mr. Nair. You have a great asset with an Indian diaspora. But India has not utilized that. China has a very small diaspora in Africa. And I speak from experience because for the major part of my career in Pretoria, I oversaw relations with Asia, including China. That's an asset. But India doesn't conduct its relations with Africa in that way. It does it from government to government. That's the first pillar in consolidating relationship. If I look at one of the complaints we had, I was at the Pravasi in Odisha a month or two ago. And for the first time, Prime Minister Modi raised the issue of the Girmitiyas, my ancestry and many other parts of where Indians went as indentured laborers. That you have neglected that. In South Africa, of course, sanctions isolated us from India for over 40, 45 years because, rightfully so, India imposed sanctions on South Africa. The Indian community had no contact. You couldn't even send a priest to a temple in South Africa or teacher of Hindi or Tamil. That's why my generation, we lost our Indian language because of the sanctions, the unforeseen cause of isolation and the impact, negative impact it had. India doesn't transact with Africa in that way. But it should start looking, and I think it's starting to do that now, that that's an asset. I mean, if we have a sizable Jewish community, the largest in Africa, they are linked with Israel. And Israel use it very, very effectively. As I've said, we now have about 600,000 Chinese that have come and settled in South Africa. I'm the honorary chairperson of China-Africa Society, South Africa Society. And I see how they network and use the local Chinese community. There's nothing wrong in that. There's nothing ethnic about that. It's using opportunities that many others do. As I said, we have a very strong European community in South Africa. They use it very effectively. They use it very effectively. And I believe that India can develop this and use it to its advantage.
Yes, I agree with Professor Anil's point that this is not the case in Africa and how India is approaching Africa because of what the reasons he has mentioned, but also let's have Egypt as an example. And we are on the north side and we don't share same kind of history like the relationship between India and Africa you have mentioned. And if we check how the amount of economic and political relationship between India and Africa, India and Egypt, it is immense, and we have already signed a strategic partnership between India and Egypt. President Sisi, he has visited India and Prime Minister Modi also. We have investments, Indian investors investing huge amount of money in different sectors in Egypt, in pharmaceutical and agribusiness and also energy, because there is lots of opportunity. So again, here it is related to the investor mentality. So whenever there is a very good opportunity to invest, they will go. So they will not keep in mind that we have a strong relationship or that history or there are Indians living in this country or not. So it is about that business environment. And the countries who are able to attract more Indian investors, so they go and invest. So that's it.
So with that, I'm afraid, I know there are a few more questions, but you'll have to catch the panelists at lunchtime. But I think I have to bring this session to an end so that we can stay on schedule. Please join me in a loud round of applause for the panelists.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bambavale, and your fantastic panel. Could I please request Sanjay Kirloskar, who's a member of PIC and also the president of the Maratha Chamber of Commerce this year, to provide tokens of appreciation. Perhaps I could ask him to felicitate Dr. Hebatullah first. Dr. Hebatullah? His Excellency Dr. Anil Suklal. Dr. Renu Modi. And finally, Akshay Mathur.